Dr. Marcus Thompson had been working at Metropolitan General Hospital for 12 years, and he thought he had seen everything. The dedicated surgeon prided himself on maintaining composure during the most challenging situations, but nothing could have prepared him for what happened that Tuesday afternoon in October. He was reviewing patient charts in the surgical prep area when the first wave of what he would later call zombies shuffled through the emergency department doors. The term wasn't entirely unfair. The group of about 30 people moved with an unsettling uniformity, their faces blank and expressions vacant. They wore matching gray t-shirts with some illegible logo and moved in a pack formation that immediately set off alarm bells in Marcus's mind. What made it worse was their apparent leader, a man in his 50s with perfectly styled hair and an expensive suit, who strode confidently behind them while barking orders into a Bluetooth headset. "Remember, we need authentic reactions," the suited man called out to his followers. "This is about capturing real hospital atmosphere for the documentary. Don't break character until I give the signal." Marcus watched through the window as the group began spreading throughout the emergency waiting area, some of them groaning softly while others stared blankly at the ceiling or walls. Dr. Emily Rodriguez, the head of emergency medicine, approached Marcus with a bewildered expression. "Are you seeing this? They just walked in and started acting like they're in some kind of trance." The receptionist tried to ask if they needed help, but they're not responding to anyone. "That guy in the suit claims they're filming a documentary about hospital overcrowding, but nobody authorized this." Marcus felt his jaw tighten. As someone who had dedicated his life to healing and helping people, the sight of these individuals turning his workplace into some kind of performance art piece filled him with a growing anger. The emergency department was already struggling with genuine patients who needed immediate care, and now these people were taking up valuable space and resources while pretending to be sick. The situation escalated quickly when several of the fake patients began lying down on the floor in the waiting area, groaning loudly and making exaggerated gestures of distress. Real patients, some of whom were elderly or dealing with serious medical conditions, began looking around nervously. A woman holding her crying infant moved closer to the corner, clearly uncomfortable with the bizarre scene unfolding around her. "This is completely unacceptable," Marcus muttered, watching as the suited man directed his followers to spread out further into the hospital. "We have actual sick people here who need help, and these people are treating our workplace like their personal movie set." Security guard James Peterson approached the group's leader, his radio crackling with communications from other hospital staff. "Sir, I need to see your authorization for filming on hospital property. We weren't notified of any documentary crew today." The suited man waved dismissively at James, never removing the Bluetooth device from his ear. "This is for a very important project about healthcare accessibility. We're capturing the real experience of overcrowded hospitals. My people have every right to be here as potential patients." "But they're not actually patients," James replied, his voice steady but firm. "They're disrupting actual medical care, and we need them to either seek legitimate medical attention or leave the premises." Marcus watched the exchange with growing frustration. The suited man's arrogance was particularly galling because he seemed to genuinely believe that his project justified disrupting a functioning medical facility. The fake patients continued their performance, with some now claiming to hospital staff that they were experiencing various symptoms, forcing nurses to waste time trying to assess people who were deliberately lying about their conditions. Dr. Rodriguez pulled Marcus aside, her expression showing the same anger he felt. "We need to do something about this. I've got real patients backing up because half my staff is trying to figure out what's wrong with people who aren't actually sick. This is dangerous on multiple levels." Marcus nodded, his mind already working through the possibilities. Years of dealing with difficult patients, insurance companies, and hospital bureaucracy had taught him that sometimes the system needed a little creative intervention to work properly. The suited man and his followers clearly thought they were clever, using the hospital's obligation to treat anyone who walked through the doors as cover for their unauthorized filming project. "I think I have an idea," Marcus said quietly, a plan beginning to form in his mind. "But we're going to need to be very careful about how we handle this." The suited man, who had introduced himself to staff as Brandon Walsh, continued directing his human props with increasing boldness. He had positioned several of his followers near the triage desk, where they maintained their blank expressions while real patients waited behind them. The nurses were growing increasingly frustrated as they tried to conduct proper medical assessments on people who would only respond with rehearsed moans and vacant stares. Marcus observed Walsh's operation with the analytical mind that had served him well in surgery. The man was clearly banking on the hospital's ethical obligation to treat anyone who presented as a patient, regardless of their ability to pay or the nature of their condition. It was a cynical exploitation of the medical profession's fundamental principles, and it made Marcus's blood boil. What particularly infuriated him was watching Walsh coach his followers between takes. "Remember, you're supposed to be overwhelmed by the system," he would whisper to them. "Show the desperation of people who can't get proper health care. Make it look real." The irony wasn't lost on Marcus that Walsh was creating fake desperation while actual desperate people waited for care. Dr. Rodriguez approached Marcus with an update that made the situation even more concerning. "I just spoke with administration. Apparently, Walsh called ahead and told them he was bringing in a group of volunteers for a healthcare accessibility study. He implied it was affiliated with the state health department, but when admin tried to verify, they couldn't reach anyone who knew anything about it. So he essentially lied his way in here," Marcus said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "And now he's using our emergency department as his personal film studio while real patients suffer." The impact on actual patient care was becoming more apparent by the hour. An elderly man with chest pains had been waiting for over an hour because two of Walsh's followers had positioned themselves in front of him, blocking easy access to the triage desk. A mother with a feverish toddler kept glancing nervously at the groaning fake patients, clearly wondering if she should take her child elsewhere. Marcus made his decision. He approached Walsh directly, noting the man's expensive watch and perfectly manicured appearance. Everything about Walsh screamed privilege and entitlement, the kind of person who was used to getting his way regardless of the consequences for others. "Excuse me, Mr. Walsh," Marcus said, his voice professionally polite but firm. "I'm Dr. Thompson, one of the staff surgeons here. I understand you're working on some kind of documentary project." Walsh barely glanced up from his phone, where he was apparently reviewing footage his camera operator had been discreetly shooting. "That's right, doctor. We're documenting the crisis in American healthcare. Very important work." "I'm sure it is," Marcus replied, his tone carefully neutral. "I'm actually very interested in healthcare documentation myself. In fact, I think your project would benefit from a more comprehensive approach. Have you considered including the full patient experience from admission through treatment?" This got Walsh's attention. He looked up from his phone with sudden interest, clearly sensing an opportunity to expand his unauthorized filming. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Marcus smiled, the expression not reaching his eyes. "Well, if your volunteers are going to portray patients, they should experience the complete process. That includes proper medical evaluation, diagnostic testing, and treatment protocols. For authenticity, you understand." Walsh's eyes lit up with what he clearly thought was a brilliant opportunity. "That's exactly the kind of real experience we're looking for. We want to show what actual patients go through." "Excellent," Marcus said, pulling out his tablet and beginning to input information. "I'll need to get them all properly registered in our system. Full names, insurance information, emergency contacts. And of course, they'll need to consent to the complete diagnostic workup." "Diagnostic workup?" Walsh asked, his enthusiasm dampening slightly. "Oh yes," Marcus continued, his fingers flying across the tablet screen. "If they're presenting with symptoms, we're legally obligated to investigate thoroughly. Blood work, imaging studies, the works. We take potential medical emergencies very seriously here." Walsh's expression began to shift as he realized where this was heading. "Now wait a minute. They're not actually sick. This is just for the documentary." Marcus looked up from his tablet with an expression of professional confusion. "I'm sorry, but I don't understand. Are you saying these people are lying about their symptoms? Because that would be fraud and we'd have to report that to the authorities." The color drained from Walsh's face as the implications of Marcus's words sank in. Around them, his followers continued their performance, unaware that their leader was now trapped in the very system he had tried to exploit. Marcus felt a surge of satisfaction as he watched Walsh's confident demeanor crumble. "Look, doctor," Walsh said, his voice taking on a pleading tone that was a far cry from his earlier arrogance. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. These people aren't actually experiencing medical emergencies. They're volunteers helping with a documentary about healthcare access." Marcus nodded thoughtfully as if considering this new information. "I see. So you're telling me that these individuals came into our emergency department, claimed to be experiencing medical symptoms, and are now admitting they were lying about their condition. It's not lying, it's..." Walsh struggled to find the right words. "It's artistic interpretation. Social commentary." "Interesting," Marcus replied, making more notes on his tablet. So this is a deliberate attempt to waste medical resources and interfere with patient care for the purpose of creating entertainment content. That's actually quite serious. Dr. Rodriguez approached them, having overheard the conversation. Dr. Thompson, I've been reviewing the legal implications of this situation with hospital administration. Apparently, falsely claiming medical symptoms to gain access to healthcare facilities is considered fraud in this state. There are also potential charges related to interfering with emergency medical services. Walsh's Bluetooth headset crackled with an incoming call, but for the first time since arriving he ignored it. Now hold on. Nobody said anything about legal charges. This is just a misunderstanding. I'm afraid it's not that simple, Marcus continued, his voice maintaining its professional tone. You see, the moment your volunteers entered our emergency department and claimed to be experiencing symptoms, they became our responsibility. We're legally required to ensure they receive appropriate medical care until we can definitively rule out any serious conditions. But they're not actually sick. Walsh protested. That's exactly the problem, Dr. Rodriguez interjected. If they're not sick, then they've committed fraud. If they are sick, then we need to treat them. Either way, we can't simply let them walk out of here without proper documentation and investigation. Marcus watched Walsh's face cycle through various emotions as the man realized how thoroughly he had trapped himself. The fake patients continued their performance, but several of them were beginning to look uncertain as they noticed their leader's increasingly agitated discussion with the medical staff. What do you want? Walsh asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. What I want, Marcus said, his voice hardening slightly, is for you to understand that this is a place where people come when they're genuinely afraid for their health or the health of their loved ones. What I want is for you to realize that your little stunt has delayed care for people who actually need it. He gestured toward the waiting area, where real patients were still sitting with their genuine concerns. That woman over there has been waiting to have her child's fever evaluated because your volunteers are taking up triage resources. The man in the corner is having chest pains, but he's been pushed to the back of the line because of your performance art. Walsh followed Marcus's gaze and for the first time, seemed to actually notice the real patients his project had displaced. The woman with the feverish child was looking increasingly worried, while the man with chest pains was pale and sweating. I didn't realize. Walsh began, but Marcus cut him off. You didn't realize because you didn't care to look, Marcus said bluntly. You saw our emergency department as nothing more than a convenient backdrop for your project. You didn't think about the actual people who depend on this place for their health care. Security guard James Peterson approached the group, his radio buzzing with activity. Dr. Thompson, I've got an update from administration. The police are requesting to speak with Mr. Walsh about the unauthorized filming and potential fraud charges. Walsh's eyes widened. Police? This is getting way out of hand. Look, I'll have my people stop whatever they're doing and leave right now. No harm done. Actually, Marcus said, consulting his tablet again, there's still the matter of the medical evaluations. Once someone presents to the emergency department with claimed symptoms, we can't legally discharge them without proper assessment. It's a liability issue. How long would that take? Walsh asked, his voice strained. Dr. Rodriguez smiled grimly. Well, for 30 people with vague, nonspecific symptoms, we'd need to run comprehensive diagnostic panels. Blood work, imaging studies, psychiatric evaluations to rule out underlying conditions that might cause confusion or altered mental states. I'd estimate about 6 to 8 hours per person, assuming we can fit them into our schedule between actual emergencies. Walsh's smartphone buzzed insistently, but he seemed paralyzed by the magnitude of what he was facing. Marcus could see the man's mind racing as he calculated the implications of keeping 30 people in the hospital for medical evaluations that would reveal they had been lying about their symptoms. 8 hours each? Walsh repeated weakly. That's over 200 hours of medical time. Plus the cost of the tests, Dr. Rodriguez added helpfully. Blood panels, CT scans, MRIs if we suspect neurological issues causing the altered mental states. I'd estimate around $15,000 per person minimum. Marcus watched Walsh's face go completely white. The man was clearly doing the math in his head, realizing that his clever documentary project was about to cost him potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars in medical bills that he would be legally responsible for. There has to be another way, Walsh said desperately. Look, I'll pay for any inconvenience we've caused. I'll make a donation to the hospital. Just let my people leave. It's not about money, Marcus replied, though he was secretly pleased to see Walsh squirm. It's about patient safety and legal liability. Once someone presents to the emergency department claiming medical symptoms, we have protocols we must follow. James Peterson's radio crackled again, and he listened intently before addressing the group. The police are here. They want to speak with Mr. Walsh about the unauthorized filming and potential fraud charges. They're also interested in talking to the volunteers about making false statements to medical personnel. Several of Walsh's followers had begun to notice the commotion and were looking increasingly nervous. A few of them approached their leader, breaking character for the first time since arriving. "Brandon, what's going on?" asked a young woman who had been lying on the floor pretending to be in distress. "Some of the nurses are talking about blood tests and legal issues." Walsh waved her away irritably, but the damage was done. Word was spreading among his volunteers that their simple acting job was becoming something much more serious. Marcus could see the group's cohesion beginning to break down as people realized they might be facing real consequences for their participation in the unauthorized filming. "Dr. Thompson," Walsh said, his voice taking on a desperate edge, "surely we can work something out. I'm willing to compensate the hospital for any lost time or resources. I just need to get my people out of here." Marcus pretended to consider this, consulting his tablet and exchanging glances with Dr. Rodriguez. He was enjoying watching Walsh's arrogance crumble, but he also knew that the real goal was to restore normal operations to the emergency department and ensure that actual patients received the care they needed. "Well," Marcus said slowly, "there might be one way to handle this situation without going through the full diagnostic protocol." Walsh's eyes lit up with hope. "Yes? What is it?" "Your volunteers would need to formally admit that they made false statements about their medical condition," Marcus explained. "They would need to sign affidavits acknowledging that they deliberately misrepresented their health status to gain access to the emergency department." That's admitting to fraud," Walsh said weakly. "Yes, it is," Dr. Rodriguez confirmed. "But it's also the only way to legally discharge them without completing the full medical evaluation. The alternative is to proceed with the diagnostic workup and let the legal system sort out the fraud charges afterward." Walsh looked around the emergency department, seeing his elaborate plan crumbling around him. His volunteers were becoming increasingly agitated as they realized the potential consequences of their actions. Real patients were still waiting for care, and the police were apparently asking questions about the unauthorized filming. "And if they sign these affidavits?" Walsh asked. "Then we can process their discharge and they can leave," Marcus replied. Of course, the affidavits would become part of the official record, and the police would still want to discuss the unauthorized filming and disruption of medical services. Walsh's Bluetooth headset buzzed again, and this time he answered it with a shaky voice. "Not now," he said into the device. "We have a situation here." He listened for a moment, then his face went even paler. "What do you mean the hospital is considering a lawsuit?" The conversation Walsh was having through his Bluetooth device was clearly not going well. Marcus could only hear one side of it, but Walsh's increasingly panicked responses painted a clear picture of his situation deteriorating rapidly. "No, you can't just leave," Walsh said into his headset. "We need to handle this properly." Pause. "What do you mean the funding is contingent on not having legal issues?" Another pause, longer this time. "Hello? Hello?" Walsh stared at his phone in disbelief. Apparently, whoever had been backing his documentary project had just abandoned him upon learning about the potential legal complications. Dr. Rodriguez approached Marcus with a clipboard full of forms. "I've prepared the discharge affidavits," she said loud enough for Walsh to hear. "Each volunteer will need to sign a statement acknowledging that they made false claims about their medical condition and understand that this constitutes fraud." Several of Walsh's volunteers had overheard this conversation and were now approaching their leader with increasing agitation. The young woman who had been lying on the floor was the first to speak up. "Brandon, nobody said anything about fraud when you recruited us," she said, her voice tight with anxiety. "You told us this was just acting for a documentary. You said it was completely legal." "It is legal," Walsh replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "It's just more complicated than I initially explained." A middle-aged man who had been sitting in the corner groaning softly stepped forward. "I'm not signing anything that admits to fraud. I have a professional reputation to consider. I'm a teacher, for crying out loud." Marcus watched with satisfaction as Walsh's carefully assembled group began to turn against him. The volunteers were realizing that their leader had potentially exposed them to serious legal consequences without fully explaining the risks. "Look, everyone, just calm down," Walsh said, his voice rising slightly. "I'll handle this. Nobody's going to face any charges." "How can you guarantee that?" asked another volunteer, a woman in her 30s who had been pretending to have breathing difficulties. The police are here asking questions and these doctors are talking about fraud charges. James Peterson approached the group again, his expression serious. Mr. Walsh, the officers would like to speak with you now. They're particularly interested in your authorization for filming on hospital property and the impact on patient care. Walsh looked around desperately as if searching for an escape route. His volunteers were becoming increasingly hostile, the hospital staff was demanding accountability, and the police were waiting to question him about his unauthorized activities. This wasn't supposed to happen, Walsh muttered, more to himself than anyone else. It was just supposed to be a simple documentary about healthcare access. The problem, Marcus said, stepping closer to Walsh, is that you decided to create your documentary by actually disrupting healthcare access. You turned real patients into unwilling participants in your project. Marcus gestured toward the waiting area where legitimate patients were still sitting with their genuine medical concerns. Do you see that woman over there? She's been waiting for 2 hours to have her child's fever evaluated because your volunteers have been taking up triage resources. That man has been experiencing chest pains, but he's been pushed to the back of the line because of your performance. Walsh followed Marcus's gaze and seemed to really see the real patients for the first time. The woman with the feverish child looked exhausted and worried, while the man with chest pains was pale and clearly uncomfortable. I didn't mean for anyone to be hurt, Walsh said quietly. But you didn't bother to think about the consequences, Dr. Rodriguez added. You saw our emergency department as nothing more than a convenient set for your project. You didn't consider the actual people who depend on this facility for their health care. The young woman who had been lying on the floor spoke up again. Brandon, I want out of this. I'm not signing any fraud admission, and I'm not staying here for 8 hours of medical tests. You need to fix this right now. Other volunteers began voicing similar sentiments, and Marcus could see Walsh's control over the situation completely evaporating. The man who had strutted into the hospital with such confidence was now facing the collapse of his project, potential legal consequences, and the abandonment of his financial backing. What do you want me to do? Walsh asked, his question directed at Marcus. Marcus had been waiting for this moment, when Walsh's arrogance would finally give way to the reality of what he had done. Marcus looked at Walsh for a long moment, considering his response carefully. The man's elaborate scheme had completely backfired, and now he was facing the very real consequences of his actions. The volunteers were turning against him, the police were asking questions, and the hospital administration was considering legal action. What I want, Marcus said finally, is for you to understand that this isn't a game. This is a place where people come when they're scared, when they're in pain, when they don't know where else to turn. Your little project has turned their genuine medical needs into background scenery for your documentary. Walsh nodded weakly, his earlier confidence completely gone. I understand. I really didn't think about the impact on actual patients. No, you didn't, Dr. Rodriguez agreed. You were so focused on your artistic vision that you forgot we're dealing with real people who need real medical care. The volunteers were becoming increasingly agitated, and several of them were demanding to leave immediately. The young woman who had been lying on the floor was particularly vocal about wanting to distance herself from the project. Brandon, I'm done with this, she said firmly. I'm not signing any fraud admission and I'm not staying here for medical tests. You need to figure out how to get us out of this mess. James Peterson's radio crackled again, and he listened intently before addressing Walsh. The police officers are getting impatient. They want to speak with you about the unauthorized filming and the disruption of medical services. They're also interested in talking to the volunteers about making false statements to medical personnel. Walsh looked around the emergency department, seeing his elaborate plan in complete ruins. His volunteers were abandoning him, the hospital staff was demanding accountability, and the police were investigating potential criminal charges. Okay, Walsh said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. What do I need to do to make this right? Marcus exchanged glances with Dr. Rodriguez, both of them recognizing that Walsh had finally reached the point where he was willing to accept responsibility for his actions. First, Marcus said, you need to have your volunteers stop their performance immediately and clear the waiting area so that actual patients can receive care. Second, you need to formally apologize to the patients who have been delayed because of your project. Third, you need to cooperate fully with the police investigation. And fourth, Dr. Rodriguez added, you need to make a substantial donation to the hospital to cover the time and resources your stunt has wasted. Walsh nodded numbly, clearly understanding that he had no choice but to accept these terms. How much are we talking about? We'll calculate the exact amount based on the time spent dealing with your volunteers, the delayed patient care, and the additional security and administrative costs, Marcus replied. But I'd estimate at least $50,000. Walsh winced at the figure, but he was clearly in no position to negotiate. And if I do all of that? Then we'll work with the police to minimize the charges, Marcus said. But you need to understand that there will still be consequences for what you've done here today. The volunteers were gathering around Walsh, demanding answers and exit strategies. The young woman who had been most vocal about leaving spoke up again. Brandon, I want a written statement from you taking full responsibility for this situation. I'm not going down for your mistakes. Other volunteers began making similar demands, and Marcus could see that Walsh's problems were far from over. Even if he managed to resolve the immediate situation with the hospital, he would still have to deal with the fallout from his volunteers and the potential legal consequences of his actions. All right, Walsh said, his voice defeated. I'll do whatever you want. Just please, let's try to resolve this as quietly as possible. Marcus felt a surge of satisfaction as he watched Walsh's complete capitulation. The man's arrogance and sense of entitlement had finally met reality, and the consequences were severe. I'm afraid that's not entirely up to us, Marcus replied. The police are involved now, and there are legal procedures that have to be followed. Over the next several hours, Marcus watched as Walsh's documentary project completely unraveled. The volunteers, realizing the serious legal implications of their participation, began distancing themselves from both Walsh and each other. Most of them signed the discharge affidavits acknowledging their false medical claims, eager to leave the hospital and avoid further legal complications. The young woman who had been most vocal about leaving was among the first to sign her affidavit and head for the exit. This is the last time I ever volunteer for anything without reading the fine print, she muttered as she walked past Walsh without making eye contact. Walsh himself was taken aside by the police officers for questioning about the unauthorized filming and disruption of medical services. Marcus could see him through the glass doors of the security office, gesticulating wildly as he tried to explain his actions to the increasingly skeptical officers. Dr. Rodriguez approached Marcus with an update on the situation. The last of the volunteers just signed their discharge papers and left. We've managed to clear the waiting area and get back to normal operations. The woman with the feverish child is finally being seen by pediatrics, and the man with chest pains is getting an EKG. Marcus felt a wave of relief wash over him. The immediate crisis was over, and they could return to their primary mission of providing medical care to people who actually needed it. What about Walsh? Marcus asked. He's still with the police, Dr. Rodriguez replied. Apparently, the hospital administration is considering pressing charges for fraud and disruption of medical services. The unauthorized filming is also a violation of patient privacy laws, even though no actual patients were filmed. Marcus nodded, feeling satisfied that Walsh was facing real consequences for his actions. The man's sense of entitlement and disregard for others had finally caught up with him in a way that would hopefully make him think twice before attempting similar stunts in the future. James Peterson approached them with a final update. The police are finishing up their questioning of Walsh. He's agreed to pay restitution to the hospital and has provided a full statement about the unauthorized filming. He's also agreed to destroy any footage that was taken today. Good, Marcus said. And the volunteers? Most of them have already left, James replied. A few are still giving statements to the police, but they're all cooperating fully. Nobody wants to be associated with this mess anymore. Marcus looked around the emergency department, which was finally returning to normal operations. The waiting area was filled with actual patients dealing with genuine medical concerns, and the staff was able to focus on providing care rather than dealing with Walsh's elaborate deception. You know, Dr. Rodriguez said, I have to admit that was pretty brilliant the way you handled Walsh. Using his own logic against him like that. Marcus smiled, feeling a sense of satisfaction that went beyond just resolving the immediate crisis. He thought he was so clever, exploiting our obligation to treat anyone who presents as a patient. He didn't realize that obligation comes with very specific legal and medical requirements. The look on his face when you started talking about diagnostic workups and fraud charges was priceless, Dr. Rodriguez added. I don't think he had any idea what he was walking into. Marcus reflected on the day's events, thinking about the lesson that Walsh had learned about the real world of healthcare. The man had approached the hospital with a casual disregard for the actual people who depended on its services, seeing them as nothing more than background elements in his artistic vision. The thing that bothered me most, Marcus said, was how he completely ignored the real patients. He was so focused on his project that he didn't even notice the woman with the sick child or the man with chest pains. To him, they were just part of the scenery. Dr. Rodriguez nodded. That's the problem with people like Walsh. They think they can just walk into places like this and take what they want without considering the impact on others. As the afternoon wore on, Marcus received updates on Walsh's situation. The man had indeed agreed to pay substantial restitution to the hospital, though the exact amount was still being negotiated. He had also provided a full confession about the unauthorized filming and had agreed to destroy all footage taken during his visit. The police had released Walsh with a citation for disrupting medical services, but the hospital administration was still considering whether to press more serious charges. The volunteers had all been released after signing their discharge affidavits, though several of them were reportedly consulting with lawyers about potential legal exposure. Several weeks later, Marcus was reviewing patient charts in the same surgical prep area where he had first witnessed Walsh's invasion when Dr. Rodriguez approached him with a newspaper article. "You need to see this," she said, handing him the local paper with a grin. The headline read, "Documentary Filmmaker Fined for Hospital Hoax." The article detailed Walsh's unauthorized filming project and the legal consequences he had faced. According to the report, Walsh had been fined $25,000 for disrupting medical services and had been required to pay an additional $30,000 in restitution to the hospital. "It gets better," Dr. Rodriguez said, pointing to a paragraph further down in the article. Apparently, his funding sources pulled out completely once word got out about the legal issues. His production company is being sued by several of the volunteers who claim they were misled about the potential legal consequences of their participation. Marcus read through the article with growing satisfaction. Walsh's sense of entitlement and disregard for others had ultimately cost him far more than he had probably ever imagined. The man who had strutted into the hospital with such confidence was now facing financial ruin and professional disgrace. "There's more," Dr. Rodriguez continued. "I heard through the grapevine that Walsh tried to pitch his documentary to several streaming services, but nobody would touch it once they learned about the legal issues. Apparently, using deception to film in a hospital without authorization is a big red flag for content distributors." Marcus smiled, thinking about the poetic justice of Walsh's situation. The man had tried to exploit the hospital's ethical obligations for his own artistic and financial gain, but his scheme had backfired spectacularly. "What about the volunteers?" Marcus asked. "Most of them have distanced themselves from Walsh and the project," Dr. Rodriguez replied. "A few of them are apparently considering a class action lawsuit against him for misrepresentation. They're claiming he didn't fully disclose the potential legal risks of participating in his project." Marcus felt a deep sense of satisfaction knowing that Walsh's actions had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate disruption to hospital operations. The man's arrogance and entitlement had ultimately destroyed his professional reputation and financial stability. "You know what the best part is?" Dr. Rodriguez said. "I heard that Walsh is now working as a temp in data entry somewhere. Apparently, nobody in the film industry wants to work with him after this incident." Marcus laughed, thinking about the irony of Walsh's situation. The man who had tried to make a documentary about healthcare access was now probably struggling to afford healthcare himself. "I have to admit," Marcus said, "there's something deeply satisfying about seeing someone like Walsh face real consequences for their actions. Too often, people like him get away with their entitled behavior because institutions are afraid of conflict." Dr. Rodriguez nodded. "The thing is, he probably thought he was so clever using our ethical obligations against us. He didn't realize that those obligations come with very specific legal and professional requirements that he couldn't just ignore." As they talked, Marcus reflected on the broader implications of the incident. Walsh's attempt to exploit the hospital's mission had ultimately been defeated by the very system he had tried to manipulate. The legal and ethical frameworks that govern medical practice had protected both the institution and the patients it served. "I think the lesson here," Marcus said, "is that institutions like hospitals have these ethical obligations for good reasons. They're not just bureaucratic rules that can be gamed for personal advantage. They're there to protect people and ensure that resources go to those who actually need them." Dr. Rodriguez smiled. "And sometimes, those same rules can be used to protect the institution from people who try to exploit it." Marcus nodded, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction about how the situation had resolved. Walsh's elaborate scheme had been defeated not through confrontation or conflict, but through the methodical application of the very rules and procedures he had tried to circumvent. The emergency department around them hummed with its usual activity, filled with real patients dealing with genuine medical concerns. The staff moved efficiently through their routines, providing care to people who actually needed it. The chaos and disruption of Walsh's invasion seemed like a distant memory, but the lesson it had taught would stay with Marcus for years to come. Sometimes, the best revenge against entitled behavior was simply letting the system work as it was designed to work.